Today, we will remember the most terrible plane crashes in history, stories of loss, heroism, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. Stay with us, the beginning is shocking, and the ending will make you think. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 is a tragedy that occurred on the 17th of July 2014, when a flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was shot down over the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. There were 298 people on board the Boeing 777-200ER, all of whom died. The plane was flying in an authorized air corridor, but on that day, armed clashes between Ukrainian units and pro-Russian forces were taking place over the region. The wreckage of the airliner was scattered over a large area, and witnesses reported an explosion in the air and a fireball. Traces of debris, damage to the fuselage, and characteristic penetrating damage were found at the crash site. Independent experts and international investigation teams conducted thorough technical and forensic investigations, analysis of debris, ballistics, metallurgical examinations, study of video recordings and photographic materials, as well as collection of intercepts and other data. All this stuff together showed that the plane was hit by a surface-to-air missile with a high explosive fragmentation warhead. International investigators figured out that a buck system and components with a specific type of damage were used. The Dutch, Malaysian, Australian, Ukrainian Joint Investigation Team, JIT, concluded that the launcher from which the missile was fired had been delivered to the territory controlled by pro-Russian forces, Russia, and then returned. The investigation was based on satellite images, routes and movements of equipment, analysis of video recordings, interviews with eyewitnesses, and technical tests. These facts form the basis for criminal investigations and international statements that the passenger plane was not shot down by accident, but in the context of armed conflict. The MH17 disaster provoked a strong international reaction. The governments of the affected countries, primarily the Netherlands and Malaysia, demanded independent investigations and justice for the relatives of the victims. The families of the victims formed a coalition to preserve the memory and exert legal pressure. In the years that followed, a number of individuals were named as suspects, and some of the investigations moved to the trial stage, including in the Netherlands. However, political complications, extradition difficulties, and diplomatic disagreements have made it hard to reach a full legal conclusion. The tragedy also served as a serious lesson for civil aviation. It prompted international regulators and airlines to review routes over conflict zones, tighten risk assessments, and share information more quickly about the actual situation on the ground. MH17 demonstrated the vulnerability of civil aviation to the consequences of armed conflict and highlighted the need for preventive measures to protect passengers. The memory of those who died remains the subject of international attention. Mourning events and legal initiatives are held annually in different countries, and the victims' families demand compensation and the truth. The event left a deep mark on the public consciousness, becoming a symbol of tragedies in which civilian infrastructure and people become victims of military action and political confrontation. The investigation into MH17 was characterized by a high degree of international cooperation. Forensic scientists and aviation experts from different countries exchanged data, interviews, and methodologies to create the most objective picture of what happened. Individual fragments of the fuselage with characteristic dents and holes were analyzed, which could provide accurate clues about the direction and nature of the damage. Metallographic and chemical tests revealed traces of explosives and structural elements corresponding to typical anti-aircraft missile components. Open sources, including social media posts and amateur videos, became a crucial element in reconstructing the course of events. Researchers tracked the movement of vehicles, assessing timestamps and geographical landmarks, and comparing them with satellite images to reconstruct the delivery route of the launcher. Fierce debates ensued in the public sphere. Official statements were accompanied by counter-arguments and alternative versions, sometimes supported by Russian state structures, which gave rise to a long information and political struggle over the interpretation of the facts. Despite the difficulties, legal proceedings led to indictments against a number of individuals involved in the delivery and use of the weapons. Court hearings allowed the relatives of the victims to obtain formal recognition of guilt from the point of view of the investigation, although the practical implementation of the sentences is a matter of international politics and the enforcement of sanctions. In addition to the legal aspects, the humanitarian consequences played a significant role. Relatives and communities lost loved ones and often faced protracted emotional and material difficulties. Many sought psychological help, created memorial funds, and supported projects to preserve information about the victims. The disaster also prompted a review of access to airspace over regions of armed conflict. International organizations and airlines stepped up their monitoring of the situation and developed mechanisms for temporarily closing routes to minimize the risk to civilian flights. This tragedy highlighted that in the era of global aviation, decisions on flight routes must take into account not only economic and operational factors, but also the real threat from armed systems, the availability of information on hostilities, and the transparency of cooperation between states. Nevertheless, questions remain. Many independent analysts emphasize that, in order to ensure complete justice, broader international mechanisms are needed that can enforce sentences and compensation and prevent similar incidents from happening again in the future. The memory of the passengers of MH17 has become a symbol of the need for international agreement on the protection of civil aviation and the importance of preserving evidence in armed conflicts. Every court hearing, every report published, and every compensation payment to relatives is a step toward restoring justice, but the depth of the loss remains irreparable. People's lives, plans, and dreams were cut short in an instant. The international consensus that has emerged on the unacceptability of attacks on civilian aircraft during conflicts has strengthened the position of regulatory authorities and become part of the lessons learned by the global aviation industry from this tragedy. The memory of MH17 is preserved by museums, memorials, and educational initiatives. Stories about the passengers, their families, and how one tragedy affected international security are part of educational programs and public campaigns aimed at preventing future disasters. Thus, MH17 not only claimed hundreds of lives, but also became a factor that changed approaches to air traffic safety, international law, and cooperation between states in crisis situations. The lessons of this tragedy continue to be discussed, and the demands of relatives and the international community serve as a reminder of the importance of responsibility and cooperation in a global world. American Airlines Flight 587 was an aviation disaster that occurred on the 12th of November, 2001, when an Airbus, a 300-605R passenger airliner, flying from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York to its destination of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, crashed shortly after takeoff and crashed into a residential area on the south coast of Queens. There were 260 people on board, including passengers and crew, and as a result of the tragedy, all those on board were killed, as well as 5 residents of the area on the ground, for a total of 265 victims, making it one of the most tragic disasters in the history of aviation in the United States at the beginning of the 21st century. Immediately after the crash, a flood of questions and assumptions arose in the public sphere, given that the event occurred just 1 month after the September 11 terrorist attacks. Many feared a possible terrorist cause. But operational and technical investigations quickly guided investigators in the areas of flight data, wreckage analysis, and witness accounts, allowing them to rule out malicious intent and focus on the flight dynamics in the first minutes after takeoff. The plane took off in standard mode, but soon entered an area of vortex turbulence created in the wake of a preceding heavy aircraft. The pilots felt a sudden movement and tried to stabilize the aircraft, But during a series of control actions, the co-pilot made repeated sharp steering inputs with the rudder pedals that exceeded the normal operating limits for this type of aircraft. As a result of these energetic maneuvers, variable and impact loads were imposed on the tail structure, which was not designed for such extreme combinations of control actions and aerodynamic effects. As a result, the vertical keel separated from the fuselage, the aircraft lost aerodynamic stability and soon broke up in the air, causing debris to fall on a residential area and resulting in serious human and material losses. The investigation into the causes and sequence of events involved complex work to reconstruct the flight parameters from the flight recorders, analyze fragments of the skin and replaceable structural elements, as well as interview eyewitnesses and study the weather conditions on that day. It was established that the immediate trigger was vortex turbulence, but the critical factor that significantly exacerbated the consequences was the crew's excessive and incorrect response to the disturbance, manifested in aggressive steering inputs. The NTSB and other participating organizations conducted a detailed ballistic, metallurgical, and structural examination, identifying characteristic damage and points of failure, which made it possible to construct a coherent picture, from the initial aerodynamic impact to the failure of the controls and the final destruction of the aircraft. The reports emphasized the role of human factors, the interaction between pilots and the control system, and the importance of training and procedural control when operating the rudder in critical situations. The ensuing public discussions and official conclusions prompted a review of crew training practices, in particular training in countering wake turbulence and the correct use of rudder pedals, and contributed to the refinement of guidelines on safe separation between aircraft during takeoff and landing. Airlines updated their simulation training programs, and regulators focused on the need to strengthen pilot training standards regarding the incorrect use of steering inputs. The tragedy had profound social consequences. The families of the victims and residents of the affected areas faced grief, loss, and lengthy recovery processes. Initiatives were launched to protect the legal interests of relatives, create memorials and relief funds, and promote psychological support measures for survivors and witnesses. Local communities spent a long time rebuilding, destroyed homes and infrastructure, and the disaster itself left a lasting mark on the memory of New Yorkers. On the global aviation scene, the incident became a subject of study and discussion as an example of how a combination of weather conditions, aerodynamic effects, and human reactions can lead to disaster even on modern aircraft, and served as motivation for strengthening international exchange of experience in the field of safe air transport operations. In the legal and regulatory field, requirements emerged for stricter control of training procedures, improved simulations of real emergency scenarios, and the development of clear guidelines for pilots on minimizing the adverse effects of encountering severe turbulence. These changes were seen as an attempt to learn from the tragedy and reduce the likelihood of similar events happening in the future. Although immediate technical diagnoses attributed the disaster to a series of control errors and extreme loads that occurred in a unique combination of conditions, the memory of the victims lives on in the public consciousness, in commemorative events, publications, and educational projects dedicated to flight safety and support for families who have suffered irreparable loss, and the lessons of this case are still cited in the context of improving procedures and preventing human error in air transport. The TAM Airlines Flight 3544 crash occurred on the 17th of July, 2007, and left a deep mark on the history of Brazilian aviation. At noon, an Airbus, a 320-passenger plane, while approaching Congonhas Airport in Sao Paulo, encountered a series of adverse factors, failed to slow down effectively and stay within the runway, veered off the runway, crossed the adjacent highway, crashed into a warehouse terminal, and instantly burst into flames, killing 199 people and causing extensive damage at the scene. Local emergency services, firefighters, medical teams, and police immediately began rescue operations. But the intensity of the fire, the scattering of debris, and the dense urban development around the airport significantly complicated search and rescue efforts, as well as the evacuation of victims. Many of the injured were taken to hospitals with severe burns and injuries, and their relatives began the long and painful process of searching for information and resolving legal issues. The investigation into the causes of the crash was conducted by national aviation authorities and independent experts. The investigation examined the parameters of the flight recorders, the condition of the runway, the weather conditions at the time of landing, and the actions of the crew, as well as the technical condition of the braking and thrust control system. Attention was drawn to factors that, taken together, could have led to the tragic outcome. Heavy rain and a slippery runway surface, the profile and drainage characteristics of the pavement, the configuration of the aircraft's equipment, and possible inaccuracies in the position of the thrust levers, as well as issues of procedural discipline and interaction in the cockpit during the transition to manual control in the critical phase of landing. The reports emphasize the complexity of the causes, not a single defect, but the combined effect of several factors, which led to the loss of control of the aircraft at a time when there was very little time to rectify the situation. The public reaction in Brazil was sharp. The tragedy sparked a wave of demands for a review of safety at Congonhas Airport, for the modernization of drainage systems and runway profiles, for tighter control of operations in bad weather, and for a review of the rules for the location of urban infrastructure near airports. Relatives of the victims joined forces in initiatives to ensure transparency in the investigation and compensation, while journalists and human rights activists closely covered the investigation and legal proceedings. In addition to technical expertise, organizational issues were also discussed. The airport's readiness to receive flights in rainy weather, the quality of runway maintenance, the planning of safety zones around the runway, and the need for strict operating regulations in case of deteriorating weather conditions. Inspections and court proceedings revealed gaps in certain practices and served as an impetus for change. Airlines revised their crew training programs, adding simulation training for landing on wet runways and responding to non-standard instrument readings. Aviation regulators tightened requirements for pavement inspections and risk assessment procedures, and municipal authorities addressed issues of urban planning regulations and the provision of protective zones around the airport. The economic and social consequences were also significant. Airport operations were temporarily reduced, the carrier's reputation was severely tested, and lengthy discussions ensued in society about the balance between the convenience of an urban airport and the risks it poses to densely populated residential areas. Volunteer and charitable initiatives, medical and psychological assistance proved to be an important part of the support provided to the families of the victims, but none of these efforts could compensate for the loss of loved ones. The processes of compensation and determining responsibility dragged on for years and were accompanied by emotional and legal difficulties for those who had lost relatives. The scientific and practical lessons of the disaster were learned by the industry. Flight safety specialists analyzed the hydroplaning and skidding episodes. Engineers developed recommendations for improving tire traction and installing effective water drainage systems, and educational institutions included a review of TAM 354 inches, their courses on crisis management, and the human factor in aviation. The memory of those who died is preserved through memorials, publications, and educational projects, which are designed not only to honor the individuals and stories of those on board, but also to serve as a warning and an incentive for the continuous improvement of safety standards. The tragedy showed that preventing such events requires an integrated approach combining infrastructure investment, strict regulations, and ongoing professional training for crews and airport staff. The disclosure of details in public discussions have contributed to greater transparency in the aviation sector and stimulated political decisions, aimed at reducing the likelihood of similar incidents recurring, while the public continues to demand accountability and responsibility from those responsible for flight safety and the infrastructure in operation. The TAM 354 crash serves as a reminder that the cost of mistakes in aviation can be irreparable and requires all participants in the process, from engineers and regulators to pilots and municipal authorities, to combine extreme accuracy, professionalism, and preventive planning to save lives and prevent new tragedies.